Despite this being one of the first mirrorless cameras to ever be released by Fujifilm, 11 years later in 2024, this camera is still very much sought after by photographers, and it's fetching prices on the second-hand market that are well above that of cameras of a similar age. So why are so many photographers fighting to get their hands on such a seemingly outdated camera like this? Well, truthfully, there are multiple reasons which we'll go over in this video, but the most common one is to do with what sits behind the lens, because this is just one of 3 camera designs to ever include the first generation of 16 megapixel X-Trans sensor. Why is this sensor such a big deal? Well, before I can go into all of that, I first need to explain where this sits in the Fujifilm lineup. This is the Fujifilm X-E1, and it was designed to be a smaller, lighter, and slightly stripped back version of the original X Pro 1, which also happened to be one of the other cameras to include the same sensor. The third and final camera in this exclusive club is the smallest sibling, the XM1, though this was quickly phased out of production for various reasons, which I've actually covered in a video up here. So let's assume for a moment that you are one of the photographers looking to actively buy a camera like this to gain access to the coveted first generation of X-Trans sensor. Question is, which one do you buy and why is it the X-E1? Well, for me, it's the classic Goldilocks tale. One of them's just too big, one of them's too small, whereas this one, it's just right. And that's because this X-E1 is slightly smaller and lighter than the X Pro 1, which generally makes it feel more portable, but the design is still large enough to accommodate all of those sought after manual controls and shortcut buttons, which unfortunately isn't the case for the tiny XM1. Now, before we go any further, I will confess that I've only reviewed the X Pro 1 once in my life, and that was actually all the way back at its original launch in 2012 when I worked for a photography magazine, so my memory of it is understandably hazy. However, I do currently own the X Pro 2, which I shoot with a lot, and I actually think it's one of my favourite cameras of all time. So with me having such an attachment to the X Pro 1 design, I will admit when I bought this camera, my initial fear was that I just wasn't going to like it. However, that really wasn't the case at all, and I actually think that in some ways the redactions and alterations made to this camera actually make it the superior design. Despite its smaller frame, it's incredibly comfortable to hold, and provided that you don't go ahead and slap a hefty great lens on the front, at no point have I felt like I was going to drop it or that I needed to buy an additional hand grip. I mean, granted, me being me, I couldn't help myself, and I did end up fancying it up a little bit with some peripherals like this gold soft shutter release button and also this thumbs up grip that slides nicely into the hot shoe port, but honestly these are purely optional extras rather than being a necessity. Now, the build quality on this camera is top tier, and it's made predominantly from metal, and on the top plate there's a dedicated dial for shutter speed as well as an exposure compensation dial. Next to the shutter release there's also a customizable button which I set to ISO so that I have access to the exposure triangle all within reach of my right hand. Now, although there's no joystick on the back for moving around the active AF point, there is at least a dedicated shortcut button to the left of the screen which grants quick access to this option. But for the most part I shot with this cheap manual focus lens, but more on him a little bit later. As I've already kind of mentioned, the X-E1 did have a few of its features chopped off, and the most noticeable one is that it doesn't have that cool hybrid optical viewfinder design like on the X Pro. But the good news is that it does at least have a standard EVF, which is actually a noticeable upgrade over the X Pro 1 in terms of resolution, because it provides a crispy 2.3 million dot display as opposed to a 1.44 million dot on the X Pro 1. It also includes a diopter dial, which is obviously far more convenient if you wear glasses, because with the X Pro 1 you actually had to buy separate screw-on correction lenses to match your glasses prescription, which I kind of think is charming in a weird sort of way, but I also imagine that's quite annoying. Now, I will admit that I rarely ever use the optical viewfinder on my X Pro 2, as I do prefer the mod cons of having an EVF. So for me personally, not having this feature really didn't bother me in the slightest, though I will say that I think stylistically there's certainly something about the glass window on the front of the X Pro that just makes it look way cooler. But if we put vanity aside for a moment, the X-E1 actually comes with a few smaller benefits, including having a mic input and a pop-up flash. Again, two features that the X Pro 1 just completely lacks. However, inevitably there are going to be a few downsides to owning this camera, especially because of its age, and in my opinion the biggest downside of all is the screen. Now, that's not because of its size or the fact that it's fixed in place, but rather that it's noticeably low resolution with just 460k dots. So most of the time I found myself prioritizing the EVF while shooting, which to be honest is a much nicer way to compose your shots anyway. Now, after spending a few days shooting with this camera, I was instantly reminded why so many people love this X-Trans 1 sensor. Honestly, I can't quite put my finger on it, but there's certainly something about the colors and tonality captured by this camera that just make the images look different to any other Fujifilm camera that I've ever tested. Perhaps it's because modern cameras are almost just too clean and clinical these days, and having a camera that's just a little less perfect almost makes the images look more nostalgic and film-like. Or perhaps Fujifilm really did just strike gold on the first go and they made something that even they can't quite replicate. Or maybe the images aren't actually anything special at all and we're all just looking through rose-tinted glasses and a haze of nostalgia. Honestly, who knows? But whatever it is, I like it and I don't really care if I ever find out the answer. And one thing is for certain, despite this sensor being being over a decade old, it's still able to capture bags of detail, and when editing the raw files, I really didn't have any issues at all when bringing back lost details in either the highlights or the shadows. Now, speaking of editing RAWs, I should also mention that all of the photos you've seen so far have been edited using my brand new Lightroom presets that have gone on sale on my equally brand new website. At this point, I've got to say a big thank you to Pixper for sponsoring the build of this website, because using their super easy to use platform, I was able to build this entire website from scratch with very little website knowledge in just a few days. So if you are interested in buying any of my presets, just head over to tomcalton.com and also use the code PIXPER to get 20% off my entire preset pack. Or if you just want to learn more about how you can create your own website using Pixper, then you can follow the links in the description below. Or alternatively, if editing just isn't your thing and you prefer to escape the grind of post-production, then obviously with this being a Fujifilm camera, you do have access to film simulation modes, which will allow you to capture some beautiful looking JPEGs straight out of the camera with no additional editing. Though just bear in mind that with this being a first generation camera, the list of film sims on this will be much limited than on more modern versions. However, the good news is there are still plenty of good film recipes for you to find online which you can play around with. So at this point, you're probably wondering what's with the funky gold lens I've been using. Well, this is the Risespray 35mm f1.6 Mark V, and it cost me around $34 from AliExpress. Now, I'll be honest and say that the reason why I bought this is firstly because I love gold. And the second reason was because it was very, very cheap. However, after shooting with this lens for a while, I was actually fairly pleasantly surprised with the results. Granted, it is not the sharpest lens in the world, I can't stress that more, but if you do close it down to around f5.6 or f8, it really isn't all that bad. However, hands down, the weirdest thing about this lens is that no matter what aperture you seem to close it down to, this thing will always create this weird, super thick blur at the corners of the frame. Now, although I do kind of like this effect, it does kind of give your images a Lomo sort of vibe. Admittedly, it isn't going to be suitable for everyone or for every occasion, so that's why I've also been shooting with this. What? No, it's not Ronald McDonald's severed cock. It's actually the TTArtisan 27mm f2.8 Twilight Flame Edition. Not only is this one of the cheapest autofocus lenses you can currently buy, specifically for Fujifilm X mount, but it's also a pretty damn good lens considering that it's fully autofocus and costs just $150. It has an all-metal build and the image quality it produces is pretty good. Plus, if for some weird reason you don't want yours to look like a clown's chode, then you can also buy it in black or titanium finishes. Once you've factored in the 1.5x crop, you will end up with photos that look closer to something like a 40mm lens on a full frame camera, which actually is a pretty good all-rounder lens. Sure, the autofocus probably isn't as fast as the Fujifilm equivalent, but if fast autofocus is what you're after, then you probably shouldn't be buying this camera in the first place, because this camera is old and slow. But if you're willing to take your time and embrace shooting at a slower pace, then this classic camera will certainly reward you for your efforts.